6:30, and I think we can probably start this thing as people will jump in. So hi, everybody. Welcome to this session looking at covering protests and how to stay safe doing so. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves and talk just for a minute about what they do and maybe a memorable protest that they've done recently. We're going to talk a lot about that. If you have questions as we go along, pop them in the chat, which is over on the right side of your screen. If you'll have to minimize, get out of full screen view to see the chat, and we'll try and make this as interactive as we can. I'm Bill Kole. I'm the New England editor for the Associated Press. I spent most of my career with AP overseas as a foreign correspondent, but back in my native New England for the last 10 years or so. Love it. And have covered a few protests, especially in Kosovo and Bosnia, that were pretty rambunctious back in the day. I'm going to throw it to Meghan, who can start the introductions.
I'm Meghan Ottolini. I'm a reporter from the Boston Herald. What I usually do for the Herald is I go out and I write for the paper and act as a reporter that way, but almost everything I do has a video component to it. So I put together pieces, just me with a microphone and a camera, sometimes a tripod, report on camera, and of course conduct interviews, write scripts, produce and edit it, and run that alongside stories I do. So, I mean, the most memorable protest I've covered was this past summer, the protests in Boston that ended in downtown Boston, and after night fell got pretty violent and rambunctious. So that's the one that has to stick out. Some police property, including a cop car, went up in flames about a block from the Freedom Trail. So it was some visual stuff and a little bit of scary stuff.
All right, Daniela, we'll throw it to you for an introduction.
Hi, I'm Daniela Altimari, and I'm a state capitol reporter at the Hartford Courant. I was going to say that, generally I cover legislative hearings and, state politics. And, generally we don't think of that necessarily as protests, although over this past year, the political beat, really probably even before this past year, maybe over the past 4 or 5 years, the political beat has become much more of the protest beat. There's been much more activism. And I was going to say, that's probably a new thing, but maybe folks who were around in the 60s would disagree and say that was when a lot of this stuff started. So it's probably in some ways inextricably tied to the beat that people who are involved in politics are also often involved in protest movements. And just over the past year, covered everything from Black Lives Matter protests to protests at the state capitol over vaccine mandates and mask mandates and things like that. So we've certainly seen a lot of activism this past year.
Yes, and just your location, working out of the Statehouse, I mean, those are common venues for protests. So thanks, Daniela. My brother, Julio, tell us about you. Julio's about to cover an Orioles-Red Sox game, I think, right?
Yeah, so...
Go O's!
I wanted to introduce myself, here without the mask, but I have to wear the mask because of I'm in a photo workroom here. But essentially, I'm a photographer with the Associated Press, based here in Baltimore. I covered about 70% sports, but I do get to do my fair chase of news. And I'm really honored to be in this group, mostly because one of my idols is Foreman. And his photo that he made at a protest, definitely sparked my interest in news photography early on. So that's really cool for me to be able to do this. So a little bit about my workplace. I did the Minneapolis protest following George Floyd, and then the insurrection of the Capitol in January 6th. So it's
That's a great segue right into what we're talking about today. I'm going to just share my screen for a second. I just want to show you a pretty iconic photograph that you may have seen. This is a photograph that Julio made about 3 or 4 days after George Floyd was killed, and Minneapolis pretty much convulsed into protest. So that's a picture that's kind of become really emblematic of this past year for us, and as a nation, and the reckoning, and also all of us who've been sucked into the vortex of covering these transcendent events. So that's an amazing thing. I also want to just play a quick clip of Julio and his colleague John Minchillo at the Capitol insurrection when they were set upon by a mob. I'll play that clip. It's about 45 seconds. And then, Julio, maybe you can walk us through afterwards what that was all about and kind of break it down for us. So let me try this again. Bear with me a second. Okay. So you were Antifa, apparently, Julio. That was really scary. A lot of us were terrified when we saw that. Break that down for us. What exactly did we just see there, and how did that happen?
Yeah, this happened after the mobs tried to get into the door, confronted by the cops, and so the reason it became violent towards the media was they were being contained at the moment. So they were starting to get frustrated, and soft targets are usually journalists, so they turned to us. We never engaged in any kind of argument whatsoever, but working with John Minchillo next to me, I turn around and he's getting pulled down those steps, and my instincts is, how do I get him out of there? So singled him out. He was wearing all black, so kind of they thought he was Antifa, or they were just throwing away that word just as the moment. But really, like, I was wearing gray pants and a brown jacket, so I kind of blended a little more, and I jumped in the middle to try to break it up. That kind of calmed things down, but it was really scary because somebody could have easily harmed them more than just throwing them over that retaining wall. But all day, this happened at about 1:30 in the afternoon. All day since the morning, we were getting heckled by the protesters. So it wasn't necessarily weird that it happened. It's just it was a little scary. We shook that off. We went around to another part of the Capitol to try to get in, and the more agitated these people got towards whatever they were fighting against, they were turning it on us.
So just a follow-up, I guess, is, did you have any AP gear on or anything that identified you as a journalist? And what would be the pros and cons, maybe, of wearing something that gave your news organization affiliation in that setting?
normally you try to have some sort of press badge on you, and we did. We had our press badges on, but when things got a little crazy, I would always slide my credential in my jacket. The fact that this is January, it's pretty cold, so it's easy to go incognito because you wear a go jacket, so they're not seeing that you're wearing a flap jacket, which they see that as a threat. I'm able to tuck my cameras in my jacket, whenever I feel I'm getting, a dicey situation. It should have been in January when it's blazing hot. There's not much you can put on yourself without like looking weird. So, but no, we didn't have any besides the credential. We didn't have anything that said, "Look, we're press." Our video colleagues who were set up for their live shots, with tripods and stage lights and everything, they got attacked really, really. I don't know if you've seen the videos, but all their equipment got broken because they were like obviously new. With me, I was wearing the brown, and I tried to be incognito. That kind of helped me out, but they still see the cameras and they jump to conclusions that we're the enemy because we're the press.
Right. Now, one other question, and I'm going to throw it to Meghan for a second to ask her a follow-up, but you and Minchillo, the other AP photographer at the Capitol insurrection, were working as a team. And so as I understand it, you were able to look out for each other, and that's kind of your work ethic. And can you just talk a little bit about that, the advantages of that?
Yeah, we do that a lot. We did that in Minneapolis. The 5 days that we covered really hard click. We stayed there. We didn't leave each other's side, and it's really interesting. When I made that flag photo, we actually broke away for minutes. He was asked to shoot live video through a network that we have for our AP video members. So he stepped away, and I was just kind of watching things from far, making sure that if he got in trouble, I could go grab him. So we kind of work in that situation. There's a lot of videos from January 6th on my social media and Instagram where you can see how we operate. There's one where you can see us like making eye contacts, making sure like going that way. We stay together. The main thing is staying together because anything like this could happen. And I would have never known if he got over and dragged away. I would have never known what happened to him.
Right. So in contrast to that, then Meghan, I mean, from what I understand about the way you work, you're often sort of working by yourself. Correct me if I'm wrong about that. And what are the disadvantages of sort of being like a solo act out there?
Yeah, I'm definitely working by myself in terms of my production. I don't have a crew. Occasionally I'll have a still photographer with me, but that person, even though we're together, they're focused on their own work and trying to get the shots and trying to see everything around them at all times. So we may be looking out for each other, but at the same time, we're both very focused on whoever we're talking to or whatever is just happening in front of us. So, it's not as though I couple protests, especially around the election, even just locally, where the local news stations had brought security teams with them, the local TV stations, and they were very surprised that I didn't do that. And that didn't even occur to me. There have been moments when I have felt it really depends on the protests that I've covered. And I wonder if Julio feels the same way. Certain protests I go in and I feel like I need to be more aware of the protesters around me, the demonstrators, and the way that they might turn. There are certain protests where I feel I need to be more concerned with the people who are trying to maintain order in terms of the police, and not like that I think they're coming after me or anything, but I've covered protests where they do use tear gas or pepper bombs or something like that. And so just being aware of where the police in those situations are corralling people to the side so I can get out of there because I don't want to be tear gassed while I'm working.
Yeah, I hate when that happens. Daniela, can you talk a little bit about just, it's one thing to, step outside the State House and then you're in throngs of people, and you face the uncertainty of what that might become. But you were doing this in a COVID year. What kind of precautions were you taking for your, safeguard yourself, your health, that of your family?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely added another dimension. I will say, I covered a very large and almost spontaneous, very sort of loosely organized, but incredible protest in June, right after the George Floyd murder, when cities all over the country were having these protests, and the overwhelming majority were peaceful and were just this sort of outpouring of people into the streets. And it was a hot day, it was outside. I felt fairly okay. Most people were masked, but again, we were outside, and I think the risks are certainly significantly lower, if not, much lower, given that you're outside in the fresh air as opposed to in an indoor space. So in that way, I wasn't concerned. Just recently, as I mentioned, I covered a protest in Connecticut. As in many states, they're trying to close some loopholes regarding vaccinations. Nothing to do with COVID vaccines. This is, the regular immunizations that school kids would get. And there was a huge number of people in Connecticut that are protesting this, as they have in other states around the country. And I think most of those people were not wearing masks. Very, very few were. But again, it was outside, so it felt much safer. It was sort of at a time when we were going through, the second or third wave of COVID, as opposed to back in June, when the numbers were really falling after that first spike in our state. So, but I have to say, I never felt unsafe because of that. Again, just being outside.
Yeah, that's interesting. Here's a question I'd like to just throw to the group, and you guys can, whoever wants to grab it. But, this past year, of course, we've been working remotely, and certainly text reporters, I'm sort of that, text is like my primary currency in my job, and, have had the luxury, if you will, of sort of staying a little, at arm's length from some of this stuff. And we found creative workarounds. Not that we don't go into protests and to get quotes and stuff like that, but it's our visual colleagues who really don't have a choice. The story has to be told, and you have to be there to tell it. Can you guys talk about what the policies are like in your news organizations? Are you, do your news managers give you the option, or, do you feel uncomfortable sometimes that you feel like you're required to step out there, whether it's health-wise or just, in a general safety realm?
I can speak to that. I mean, I have been working through the entire pandemic. So from last March, the first shutdown, to now, I've basically been out in public in masks. I started wearing a mask very early on, just because I felt like my parents are both physicians and they recommended that. So I felt like it was the best way to protect the people I was interviewing, and hopefully myself, but who knows with all the science. My editors don't ask me to do anything that if I'm uncomfortable with it. And I do feel that because I'm young and relatively healthy, I feel pretty confident in a lot of the situations in terms of the COVID protocols that I go into in dealing with people. Obviously, at the very beginning of the pandemic, I was extremely strict about putting more than 6 feet between me and whoever I was interviewing, which ended up made for some tough audio for some of my videos. But, I told my editors that, and they said, we have to do what we have to do right now. And if you're going out there and that's the way that you're going to get audio, everybody's working around this right now. But there have been 1 or 2 cases where I said, I feel kind of weird about the way these people are acting right now. I don't, especially when it's, there have been cases where it's very targeted against the media. And I feel it's better to retreat and just say, I don't really feel great in this situation. I'll stay here if you need me to, but I don't want to be alone right now where I am, or something along those lines. And they're always say, if you feel like there's something dangerous or you're uncomfortable with it, just get out.
It's good.
Add a little bit to that. WAP doesn't call me and say, do you want do you want to go, or they just say go, which it's good. Yeah, I feel like it's a good opportunity to do something that's really important. But I know that if I ever say no, that would be okay, because I've had certain situations. For example, 2 weeks after the election, there was a meeting in Pennsylvania, and not too far from Gettysburg, where a lot of people gathered to kind of say, the election was stolen, this and that, and a lot of Republican politicians from Pennsylvania were there in a big panel, about 17 of them, and then there was, I would say, another 300 people there without masks. And the reason we were there is because Giuliani was going to give a presentation. So I shot my pictures of Giuliani, and then I called my editor and I said, look, he's just going to speak for another 15 minutes and he's done. I got the pictures. I'm going to get out because, 90% of these people aren't wearing masks. And my editor was like, yeah, you can get out, and I'm like, I'm not leaving. I'll be outside of the building, should something happen, I can run in, but I just don't feel comfortable. I usually triple mask. It's kind of what I do. I do the N95, a cloth mask, and then a gaiter. So I always feel like I'm super protected, but I still felt really weird. And then fast forward 2 weeks later, there was about 12 of those politicians that tested positive, and a lot of them were sick that day. Like one of them, Mastriano, who left that meeting and went to DC and met with the president, and there was a big story of he was like, yeah, I was like within feet from this guy earlier in the day, and I'm glad I was like, I had the support from the company where I said I don't feel safe. I'm out, and they said, okay, that's good. Like, and I feel that's the same for protests. Since we're on the field, they trust us to call and say, this is going to get really ugly. I need to back off, and I usually carry a 100 or 400 millimeter lens as my big lens, and then a 16 to 35. So should I feel in any danger, I can back up from across the street and shoot it with the 400. So and they're okay with that. They make that offer many times. They if you feel bad, get out.
Now that iconic photo of the guy carrying the upside down flag in Minneapolis a few days after George Floyd's killing, you did not make that with a 400-meter lens. You were right on top of all that, right?
Yeah, that was made with the 24 to 105 lens at 24, and it's quite interesting that that moment happened because we were just getting texts from people on the scene there and from outside saying we have reports that a gas line has been severed, and you got 3 buildings on fire and a gas line open. So we backed out. This situation was a good 45 yards from the main gathering of people. So the reason that we backed off just to kind of be on the safe side worked out in my advantage, because then I see this guy walking with the flag and I followed him. Normally I follow the subject that interesting for a long time. I followed him maybe 45 seconds. I shot my pictures. I didn't chase him because I didn't want to get, obviously I wanted to get his name, but he went into the crowd and I'm like, if that blows up, I don't want to be in there. So it's one of the pictures where I'm okay not having the ID on the person.
Yes, and I'm amazed listening to you describe this, because it's not only was there COVID and cops and very angry people, but then there's a gas leak. I mean, it's like, really? I mean, what else? What? I mean, only a herd of rampaging elephants could complete the picture. I don't know. That's crazy. I'm glad that you brought up, you touched on some of these protests that we cover involve sketchy dudes. I mean, there are Proud Boys. There are other groups though that are sort of on the fringe. I'm thinking of Meghan, Super Happy Fun America. These groups that in New England that sort of agitate. And so I'm just wondering, maybe you and Daniela can talk a little bit about what's the calculus that goes into deciding whether it's to cover a protest, especially if there's are there concerns that maybe in so doing we are legitimizing these people or giving them a megaphone for a really ugly worldview, that kind of thing?
Balance. I remember after the insurrection, the assault on the U.S. Capitol, a couple of weeks after, there was some talk that every state house in the country was also going to be targeted. And I think, most newspapers, formed these teams, and we were ready. And of course, thankfully nothing happened, and it was uneventful. But you're right. I mean, it is a balance, because by drawing attention to it, you sort of you give people a platform that perhaps isn't always the responsible thing to do. It really is a balance. I remember when President Trump came to Hartford back in 2016, he actually came to Connecticut 3 or 4 times that election cycle, which is wild to think about. And that first rally in Hartford, it was really, you're right, there were definitely some sort of sketchy dudes and women as well that were, really fired up, and they were listening to the president talk about how the media lies and the press lies and don't believe it. And, you're out there trying to help people, and it's difficult. It's definitely a challenge. There's a lot of, cynicism and mistrust of us and what we do. So to try to break through that isn't always easy.
Meghan, what kind of conversations happen in your newsroom around that?
We talk about it a lot. And I think the approach is really important, because I think there's a difference between portraying something that's happening locally and, say, putting the Boston bomber on the cover of Rolling Stone. You really don't want to sensationalize people, but you can't ignore something that's happening on a big scale or an influential scale just because you don't like it, or maybe it disgusts you. Anytime that I have gone and covered different rallies that are maybe from very extremist or fringe groups, I put what they have to say out there, but I feel it's also very much my job to contextualize that in the real world. So I'm not saying any of this, and I'm not saying what they're saying is right or wrong from a moral standpoint. But if somebody says something that is blatantly untrue or a mischaracterization, it's on us to put that in our story and put that in a very highlighted manner, so that it's not somebody else's soundbite and us presenting it as if that's factual news. I think the whole approach, and also from an editor standpoint, I'm lucky in today's news media that I have 2 editors who look over everything I do in terms of writing and my video, even before it gets to the copy desk. So it's not just on me to make sure that approach is not just balanced, but also giving the right context and giving the right, factual information, because somebody also might say something that I don't know is incorrect. We're all human. I'm not a walking encyclopedia. Someone might say something about a candidate, and I put that in my story. Thank God I have 2 people who might look at that and say, that guy never said that. That's a misquote,
Right. Yeah.
I was just thinking of when you were speaking. Sorry, it just jogged my memory. That church, that Westboro Baptist Church. Remember, they used to go around the country and they would protest military funerals or whatever. And I think in the beginning, people kind of covered them like they were some sort of legitimate group. And I don't think anybody would cover them today. It's a tiny little fraction of people who have no clout and are truly doing something very cruel. And, I think that's an example of where the press has become perhaps a little more discerning in terms of what we give a platform to. And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to jump in. I just stuck in my head.
Oh, you're a panelist. That's your job description. Jump in with both feet. just a quick programming note for those who are in our session. If you have questions for our panelists, please drop them in the chat. You can see the chat. If you're in full screen mode, you'll have to get out of that, and then you'll see the chat up in your upper right corner, and you can drop questions in there, and we'll try and get to them. We'd be very happy to do that. This is maybe a little bit of a random question, but this has come up in my newsroom before, especially in conversations with our visual journalists. And that is that something I've noticed in my career covering protests is that you have this phenomenon where sometimes they're pretty chill, and then a journalist pulls out a camera, and then there's a performance that happens, which always makes me personally a little uneasy. One of our photographers was saying that his typical MO is to pull up near the protest. He might stay in his car or just keep his gear in the bag and get nearby and just sort of observe for a while and see if what he's about to photograph is actually a sort of organic, legitimate thing that's happening rather than something that people are performing for the camera. Can you guys talk about that a little bit? Have you run into that, and how do you deal with it?
I mean, that happens a lot when people kind of are performing and using the other people as kind of like pawns, for lack of a better word. And by that I mean they bring kids. And I have a huge no-no against photographing kids with a sign, because this kid might not really understand what the sign says, or they're kind of just auxiliaries to spreading that message without really knowing. So unless it's the kid's actually doing something that is active, that tells me this kid understands what's going on, I normally don't photograph it. And same if people kind of start creating, I'll photograph it just kind of to keep things down. I got attacked in Newark, New Jersey once because I didn't want to photograph this group of kids, and then they felt that I was like disrespectful, and then they beat me up. So so now I just I take the pictures. It's digital images, so I can just delete them later. And it's easier to do that and just be like, all right, cool, I got your picture, and then move on, because they'll kind of leave you alone. But that situation, somebody came from behind me and punched me in the back of the head, and could have been easily fixed just by pretending to take their picture.
Anybody else on that?
It's complicated, because the point of protesting and demonstrating is to draw attention to whatever cause you're in support or protesting for. And some of these demonstrations are really pro something. It's not all a protest of something. Some of them are still mean-spirited or aggressive, but they're in favor of something happening. I'm not going to pretend that they're not doing it because they want the press to be there. They want to draw attention to whatever cause they're concerned about. But I would say, yeah, people who seem to seek me out specifically, come up to me, tap me on the shoulder, say they have something to say, those are usually the worst people for the story. So I try to seek out people who I feel are acting most organically or most natural, because that makes a much better story, and usually, especially from a visual perspective, a better soundbite, rather than someone who is really seeking you out like a guided missile or something. Those people usually say, "Oh, I'm good," walk away.
That's a good segue to a question in the chat, sort of geared towards young journalists. The question is, for young reporters who are not really experienced with covering a protest, how what do you do when you show up? Who and how do you decide to approach? Meghan, you hit on that just now a little bit. How deep in the action can you get? And what do you do, if you become the focus of, fake news chants or other sort of hostile actions or words? This is a plea for some advice to the cub reporters out there.
it helps as what was said before, going in teams, especially if it's your first protest. If you're a reporter, go with a photographer, a camera person. If you're a photographer, go with, a videographer, a reporter, whatever, because it's generally, it's another set of eyes. It's somebody who you trust. And if you're on your own covering it, I would advise the person to seek out colleagues, even from other outlets sometimes, again, especially if it's your first time. This business is competitive, where obviously everybody wants to get the best story and beat, whoever they're competing against. But there's also a lot of camaraderie, and there's a lot of humanity that people will share things and will care for somebody, even if they're the competition. And I think for young people just starting out, I think that's helpful, because you don't want to feel alone. You don't ever want to be surrounded. There's a whole training that our paper did, and probably most news organizations, I'm sure the Associated Press, about where to, if the police come, and where you should be and where you should stand, and your object should never be to get arrested. That's, really not a good thing. And, to stay safe above all. It's obviously more important even than getting the best quote, or getting the best photo, or getting the best story.
Good. There's a question in the chat about people who might, accuse you when you're at a demo, hey, you can't take my picture. I didn't consent to it. This kind of thing. How do you, does that come up? Is that an issue, and how do you deal with it?
Don't. I'm not a news photographer in the way that Julio is, and a lot of my colleagues are, where you're usually, when you're taking a photo, oftentimes, if the situation allows, trying to get the person's personal information so that you can provide that in your caption and assure that it's a real person for your news outlet. For me, it's the law, baby. Like, locally, if you're in a public space and I get you on camera, you're now part of the story. It was your decision to come out in the public space. And I've had to explain that law to a lot of people and say, you're here in the middle of downtown Boston. What you're doing is for public consumption. You're in a public space. I've had extenuating circumstances where somebody really, really doesn't want to be out there, and it really, really doesn't add anything to my story, where I'll say, okay, here it is. It's deleted. But that's been few and far between, because for the most part, when I've gotten that kind of interaction, it's a confrontational thing of, who do you think you are, just showing up here with your camera and taking video of people? And that's our job. And you're in a public space. I didn't come into your home with my camera. So
yeah, and we've all seen the follow-up to the Capitol insurrection, where some of the marauders, were wearing like their work ID badges and stuff like that. And journalists, as well as security cameras, caught that. And now the FBI and other agencies are using it to prosecute, because they're in a as you said, Meghan, they're in a public space. So.
Video that I took right after it was the demonstration that was in downtown Boston after the weekend of George Floyd demonstrations. This was Sunday night. I had video of a number of people breaking into stores in downtown Boston and stealing jewelry. And a lot of them had hoods on, or were already wearing COVID masks. But I had a couple people reach out to me, and one person from this industry say, you shouldn't put people's faces out there in your story. Those people, the police could track them down and they could arrest them based on this. And I said, well, I'm not their lawyer. I'm not working in defense of them. And it's different to be standing out and chanting or marching through Boston than to be breaking into a storefront and stealing diamond necklaces. So that's the decision that they made. It's my job to be there and share what's happening with the rest of the city.
I'm shocked and disappointed that you don't view yourself as the sheriff of the universe, but we'll move on. You just answered, by the way, a question in the chat about this sort of common notion that demonstrators do face reprisal, and they might, right? If they it was their choice to demonstrate, and
difference between demonstrating and even, peacefully maybe breaking a law in terms of trespassing somewhere to make a point or something. I'm not here to pass moral judgment on that. That's not my job. I'm not law enforcement. But to say that you should protect someone who's committing vandalism and looting is, to me, just that's bizarre. So I don't lose sleep over that.
Right. I want to. I'm going to share my screen again, actually, and play a clip of you, Meghan, from that demo at Downtown Crossing last May that you got caught up in, and just to give people a little flavor for what it's like. I think a lot of people on the call have done this work and know, but let's just take a look at that. So that's one of the things that was interesting about that clip for me, was that you were in real time sort of trying to give some context to what was going on there, identifying the scene, the site of the first public school. I mean, that's interesting stuff. How do you, when I've covered demonstrations, it's very easy to get distracted, and you're also trying to, keep some sort of sense of your personal security and your surroundings. How do you manage to weave in some real time, context like that?
Well, I think the way that demonstration unfolded, I actually wasn't supposed to be working that night. I was just watching the local evening news and saw that things were just beginning to turn because some of the demonstrators had started throwing bottles at the police officers in front of the Statehouse. And I called my editor and to get down there like 5 minutes ago. So I went down there. So I actually had just gotten onto the scene. I had parked my car several blocks away. I had my backpack with my equipment and ran into, the kind of mob that was happening there, where they had started setting fires in the streets and breaking into some of the storefronts. And I actually wasn't comfortable taking out my true equipment at that point. So I jumped onto Twitter and Periscope and just tried to show people what was happening live, because I was just arriving on the scene and there weren't really any other media other than one AP photographer who was in the actual scene where the fires were being set by people and the breaking and entering and looting had begun. So I just felt that I needed to share where I was and what was actually happening on the ground, because I didn't really see it anywhere else.
Yeah, good. I want to just shift, also prompted by that little clip, just again, since this is a session about staying safe while doing this work. A lot of us have, social media followings. I guess some of us have large ones. I don't, but, and then that makes you almost a quasi-public figure, and people certainly troll you, and so the question is, I have read instances where journalists have taken some steps to keep people in real time from sort of figuring out where they are, disabling the geotagging on their iPhones, stuff like that. Are those things that any of you have done, and why did you do it, and is it complicated? Talk about that.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. So recently, I just did a stint at the border, and so I have a lot of family in Mexico, deep in Mexico, where some of these cartels could easily contact my family and say, you know, like, hey, I've been a victim of somebody calling my family in Mexico and saying, you know, this person, we have them, you got to give money. It's all fake, like never really happens. So as a result, when I spent my 7 days at the border, I didn't post a single image or anything on social media. I just kind of waited. And it kind of helped me kind of just stay down there without it worrying that somebody was just going to be like, oh, this guy's here. Let's dig around through his social media, find out who this aunt is, and then call her and bug her. I tried to do the same with Minneapolis, except, you know, that flag photo happened 6 hours after arriving. And then, you know, it blew up. And I normally don't post on social media until I'm done with my assignment. But that one, you know, I woke up the next morning and there was like 300 tags on my Facebook with my name with that picture. So it's like, all right, I better call my dad now and tell him that I'm over here because, you know, he's going to be, you know, really worried. So I try not to give too much information on that, and then just let the post publishing kind of do the talking.
Good. Anybody else have you covered your trail in any way? Or
I haven't, but I will say, you know, just to add another element to, you know, this whole idea of safety, I think for women, when you go to some of these events, there's an added layer, an added complication. And I'm sure, you know, for Black reporters going to a rally where there are a lot of people who are racist, it's probably also, or I'm sure, surely also, you know, adding that element. There's, you know, a lot of things that we all bring to our job, and sometimes those things can put us at risk. And so I think, you know, again, just being careful to the degree that you can is really important. Whether that's, you know, covering your digital footprint for a time, or being careful, you know, about what you post, or you know, again, going with colleagues, going in a group. I think those are all steps that you can take to ensure your safety, especially if you're in a vulnerable situation as a woman, as a Black reporter, as an Asian reporter, or, you know, whatever you would bring to your job. I think there's added steps that need to be taken.
Meghan, as a woman, are there any special precautions you take, or, you know?
No, I would say that I've dealt with a fair share of harassment, you know, from people being, as I'm trying to report, particularly for some reason when you're doing a stand-up, people feel that they have the license to shout things at you and, you know, ask you to go on a date or something bizarre, which is really frustrating to deal with. I have had some invasion of privacy, and I think that it has less to do with location that I'm in rather than just people trying to seek out information about you. I think that a lot of times comes with being, you know, a woman in a public facing job. But I haven't had too much of that on the ground. I think I probably get harassed as much as any other female reporter would. And I've, at times, there was one instance when this was happening to me during a stand-up, and luckily I had local law enforcement right next to me who stepped in and kind of de-escalated the situation. And so that helped, but it unfortunately is part of the job that you just kind of have to try to ignore the obnoxiousness of it. It's
Extremely
more obnoxious than unsafe, I would say.
Yeah, extremely unfortunate. It's abhorrent, actually, but yeah. Question for, I guess I'll flip it to Julio and Meghan, if you have ideas about this as well. Someone's asking, curious if journalists try to pre-position in windows and balconies above protests to keep away from danger and the police. And also curious if police try to oust journalists from private property adjacent to protests.
Normally, you try to be right in the middle of everything. It's been very few times where the shots could be taken from a balcony or from far away. Unfortunately, just kind of have to get in the mix. The cops, I don't think in an active police line where they're trying to clear people, I don't think they're really caring about private property. I think they just want to get everybody out. But in normal times, they're just not worried about private. I mean, unless the property owner is saying get them out of here. But going back to the situation at the border, we were trekking a lot in private land, and the authorities were just like, hey, just so you know, that's private land, and if we get a call, we're gonna have to remove you. And so I don't think they want to police us as much as we like to think, but it's always good to kind of work in the situations where you kind of, they know who you are, and they I'm pretty good about like talking to cops and be like, look, where can I stay where I'm not in your way? You can do your work, I can do my work, and I will try not to cause trouble for you. And usually they respect that. They see that as as a way of really working with them, and it works out for my advantage mostly.
As particularly for my job, because I interview a lot of people on camera, it's essential to be right in the mix of things. But like Julio said, the law enforcement is not the enemy in these situations. They're not trying to actively stop us from doing our jobs in most cases. So there's usually a reason that they want you to clear out of somewhere, and sometimes that's because there's a threat, or because there's going to be tear gas or something. So you try to work with everybody who's on scene to keep everybody safe while doing your job. But the only time I would think about getting out on a balcony or something would be if I was trying to get a shot to show the scope of the size of something. Otherwise, you're really down in the...
Right. Just to follow up on that, we've all seen clips of journalists who've been in nasty confrontations with police, and where police have, mistakenly, unlawfully, really, ordered them away and stuff like that. Have any of you had that sort of an encounter, of a confrontation? And how did you stand? Were you able to stand your ground?
I haven't had that specifically, but it surely happens, and reporters get arrested for doing their jobs. So I'm glad you mentioned that. And I do think this issue of you're in a public place and we have the right to photograph you does go for law enforcement as well. I'm not sure what the policy is in other states, but in Connecticut, there's an explicit right, a direct right, that members of the public, which includes the press, have the right to videotape and record and photograph police while they're doing their jobs. So sometimes that pushback is from law enforcement itself. And sure, you want to listen to them. And most of the time they're doing their jobs and they're not trying to hassle you, but that's not always the case. And again, just recently in Iowa and in Los Angeles, there were just, over the past few months, have been instances of reporters who were actually punished for working, for doing their constitutionally protected jobs. So
my personal experience with confrontation with the cops in situations like that has been really chaotic situations. And that is unfortunately where it comes down to self-accountability. And like we've said before, teaming up with someone, even if it's not your personal colleague, it's a colleague from somewhere else, so that, if you find yourself in a situation where a lot of times if I'm out covering something literally out of my backpack, I have my press badge, sometimes out, sometimes not, but I might be, in a black jacket, sometimes with a baseball cap on, or sneakers, because we're running around, and we don't look that different from demonstrators a lot of times. So some of these are just really chaotic situations, and you have to, once again, have a full scope of everything going on around you, including, what the cops are doing.
interesting. In Minneapolis, there was a bunch of journalists getting attacked by the cops early on, and the governor, put out a statement telling leave the press alone. They're there to do a job, and that wound up being really good for particularly for me, because at that point, it's summer, so my flak vest is on top, and I can't conceal it. And at that point, when we heard that they were trying to make sure not to target press, I was able to put on the press plaque back on the vest, and no more did I get. I didn't get any more, pepper bullets shot at me. That kind of stopped, because it was clearly visible that I was pressed. And the day I did that was probably the most violent of all the protests. Photographer from the LA Times got hit in the eye. Videographer from NBC. There's a really graphical picture. He's got his mask and he's just covered in blood. That same day, I was wearing my press thing, and I was maybe 15 yards away from them, and they didn't get hit at all. I mean, I didn't get hit at all. So clearly it worked in that situation.
We're almost to the bottom of our hour, which has just flown by. It's such an interesting discussion. There's time for another question or two if you want to drop it in the chat. And while we're waiting for that, let me just ask you guys, since there are some news managers on the call, not just reporters and photographers, videographers, what can managers do to support you, to help you just writ large, with protest coverage?
I think the main thing is supplies. There's a lot of people being put out on the field without the proper gear. A gas mask it's costly, but it's also going to save you a lot. It's going to, the return factor is going to be great because you're going to actually have the content. But even if you don't have the gas mask and all that, simple wipes. We used Sudicon wipes, and those things, if you get tear gas, it's just a wipey, and you clear your face. Within 2 minutes, you're back to normal. You're not tearing up. And those, you could get a 20 pack from Amazon for $20. I mean, it's there are ways to do it cost effectively, but a helmet of some sort, a bicycle helmet, a climbing helmet, anything that you can protect your head with. And I think the cost usually kind of is a factor, but really, it's going to be cheaper than, having to pay somebody's medical bills.
The education before the story happens is really important, because going into really confrontational and inflammatory demonstrations, I didn't know to wear goggles when I showed up. Luckily, I found a colleague who gave me goggles. I had a mask, but I didn't have goggles when the tear gas started coming out. I didn't really know when to retreat and when to push in, or anything like that. So what to do with my press badge, when to identify myself, when to kind of try to blend in and, hang out of the forefront. And my organization made a big push after a large demonstration that I covered to educate us all on that. But if you know anything about Boston, you know that there have been demonstrations and fortunately rioting and violence there for decades that we have covered as an organization. So I think keeping in mind that's something that we should train reporters on, photographers, videographers, more of a cyclical way than just when it starts becoming big news locally again.
We got 60 seconds left. Daniela, you want to wrap us up?
Just to say, it's been a great discussion. I've learned a lot from all of you guys. And I think just to underscore what Meghan just said, preparation is so key. The more you do beforehand, the better equipped you'll be in the moment, for sure.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I want to thank all of our panelists for a really stimulating discussion. Everyone, to my panelists and to everybody out there in journalism land, stay safe, be safe, in all things. And thanks for joining us. It's been a real honor. Thank you. Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Have a great rest of your conference.
Appreciate it.